let me know when we should get started, but I imagine we'll hear from Steve when his audio is fixed.
He said you could start and he'll figure it out as we go along.
Oh, okay, great. So then maybe we'll just get started. So hi, everyone. This is, I think, our third meeting with the steering committee, and today we're going to just be going over a couple of agenda items. The first is just kind of taking stock of where we are in the whole planning process. And then we're going to do a report back of what we heard from the engagement process, and then distill a couple of the major themes and takeaways from that engagement process. And then finally, we're going to talk about what our next steps are based on what we heard through that process. So where we are, I think in our first initial meetings, we shared with you what our kind of initial existing conditions analysis was, but then we really sort of leapt into more of a deep dive into engagement and outreach. So we've been kind of on this fact-finding, opinion gathering sort of session for the past month or so, and right now we're sort of coming to the close with that and sharing what we've learned from that. And if you'll remember in our last meeting when we were talking about our engagement strategy, it was really comprised of two main parts. The first part being business interviews, in which we were going to initially reach out to a number of industrial businesses and industrial business owners as well as property owners to sort of identify the right mix of people to talk to and get a sense of what the issues on the ground were related to industrial use. And then we sort of did one-on-one, or we're intending to do one-on-one and small group interviews. And sort of the second part of our engagement strategy was to do a large public survey, which we'll go into in depth, but this was really to be distributed to a broader audience of residents, stakeholders, and businesses. It's kind of a simple format, which will walk you through, and then it really allowed for survey participants to also add their own comments and statements so that it creates, so we'll dive into that. I'm not going to say too much here other than to say that we did it. And
just one other comment about the strategy is that the reason that we thought it was worth tackling, I mean, this is all about, the consultant team getting up to speed and understanding what maybe a lot of you are familiar with, but part of the point of doing this was to be able to prioritize where we could then drill into the kind of more technical planning that we're going to launch now. So it wasn't just because we were curious, but there are a couple of ways we can tackle a plan like this. And just not to spoiler alert, I think that the combination of both modes of outreach have been very productive and very useful for us, as we'll describe.
Yeah. So first, like I said, we did the business interviews. We did 8 in-depth 30-minute one-on-one interviews with sort of a mix of industrial business owners, developers, and property owners in a range of locations, both in South Norwalk, East Norwalk, along the waterfront, and we really tried to get at or contact a number of people. This is a sort of list of who we talked to. So you'll see a mix of the developers. This is by no means the list of people that we reached out to, but these were the people that we were able within sort of our time frame to have sort of productive conversations with, each one-on-one that really gave us a really good rundown of some of the issues from the perspective of business owners to the perspective of people who are actively developing industrial buildings. And then at the sort of bottom, there are people that we were able to get in touch with, but were not finally able to interview. And I mean, through those interviews that we conducted, we were able to sort of distill a number of takeaways and major themes, and these will come up again after we revisit after we talk about the public survey. But some things just to sort of tee up that conversation are sort of industrial trends, emerging e-commerce and warehouses, and how that relates to space constraints. Another one was sort of the regional position of Norwalk, as well as the regional position of, or the position of industrial businesses relative to big regional connectors like I-95, and the issue of traffic and its relationship to servicing the rest of Fairfield County. Issues related to encroachment, which include housing development as well as waterfront development, specific waterfront issues, including sort of the unique shellfish industry, marinas, as well as dredging related to access to the river, code enforcement, and that, you know, this touches on issues related to the adjacency to residential areas. And then finally, and maybe to a lesser extent, the issue of being located in a floodplain and sort of infrastructure improvements. So with that, we'll jump to the survey results.
So, you know, I think when we were talking before we launched the survey, I sort of went over some of the ideas that there would be a set of initial statements that people could agree, disagree with, or choose pass or unsure. So that was one piece. And then the other big piece of what I was talking about is that in addition to being able to vote on an initial set of statements, people could submit their own statements. And so what you can sort of see on the left here is how that ended up happening in practice. So, you know, a combination of city outreach, people publicizing the survey, led to a total of about 400 something people, or 400 unique, you know, computers, phones, whatever, that filled out the survey, which is a pretty solid number, just to be totally candid. For
It's a very solid number, especially for
a
not
city
not
of
a
Norwalk, yeah, for
Yeah,
a city
go
of
ahead.
Norwalk size that was on a topic based, you know, a specific topic study, right? We concurrently ran a very similar one of these kinds of surveys for a citywide plan and got a similar turnout. So for industry only, this I would say is pretty good. Now, underneath it, there's another number that says 366 people grouped. What that means is the point of this survey was to do two things. One, it was to classify the relationships of statements to one another. In other words, people who all sort of voted on statements being a certain way, if similarly statements are being voted on in a certain way, that would sort of show how certain statements were similar to one another. Similarly, depending on how different people voted on different statements, it related people to one another and then tried to classify them into different groups, which is what you see on the right, which sort of showed a two-dimensional scale of sort of how the different people and statements were combined with one another. And broadly speaking, it kind of chunked it up into two groups that it called, you know, A and B. A basically meant pro-industry groups that liked the idea of industrial development and wanted to have more of it. And then B was really anti-industry groups, thinking that maybe it wasn't something which Norwalk should be doing more of, or maybe something which shouldn't even have a place in Norwalk. And, you know, there was a range of sentiments. So 300 out of the 400 people voted on enough statements that the system could sort of classify them into A or B. Then this other big number is the important one, which is 23,000 votes, right? That's saying that basically across the 400 people and across the ultimately 200 statements that were submitted, each individual person voting for a statement of some kind was a vote, which means that those 400 people across the 200 statements basically weighed in on a total of 24,000 opinions about things. Not 24,000 people, not 24,000 statements, but, you know, 400 times X, because people voted on different numbers of statements, about 20 something thousand, which is a lot of different kinds of opinions. Beyond this, you know, initial 10 or 20 statements that we submitted, there were a total of 200, most of which were user generated. And finally, you know, that basically means that on average, the average person who filled this out weighed in on about 50 statements.
Yeah, I have a quick question, if you don't mind, Will.
Yes, yes.
Were you able to track where these votes came from as far as location in Norwalk, non-Norwalkers, specific information like that? Trace?
No.
No.
No. The reason why we could have put in a couple questions about that, but what I think we found over time is the more you try to collect demographic information about the survey itself, the less people want to be filling it out these days anyway, with so many different surveys going around. So it was a little bit of a calculation we decided not to do too much on to keep it streamlined. Now, that said, we did ask there were some data questions that we called metadata. And not everyone necessarily filled out, but it was like, my business in Norwalk rents its space, or my business in Norwalk owns its space. So if you're an industrial business owner, which was the initial outreach, people voted one or the other. And if you were a resident, then you would say pass or does not apply. So what we found, just that was the primary sort of metadata question that we asked. And for whatever it's worth, there was a solid contingent of people who either rent or own that were in group B too. So the anti-industry wasn't purely just, I only want residential, I hate industry. Sometimes it was just frustration with the process together. And so we'll get into that a little bit in the next slide.
Thank you.
Next couple of slides.
I think it's a good question, and I think Will's answer is an important one. We found the more you get into the questions without a lot of that survey buildup, the more engaging the survey is, and the more people are willing to ask their own questions. And so the other data points about the level of engagement is proof that generally people thought this was a pretty cool survey to do. Go ahead, Will.
I mean, it also depends on, just real quickly, the outreach. I mean, I would not be surprised if a large amount of these votes came from, say, East Norwalk, which we had a group who advertised and promoted, have folks to chime in on it. I'm just curious, it's like, I don't want to say the votes would be tainted or biased in any way, just be good, to have that information. I thought it may be useful personally to me to know, say, 3/4 of them came from, residents of East Norwalk versus South Norwalk and so forth. But I hear you, the points you're making.
It's a good point. And there's a couple ways that tangentially you could kind of see some of it. And it was also actually the statements themselves submitted. Statements that were specific to issues in East Norwalk or South Norwalk, we can pretty logically conclude are probably submitted by people either who live there or who are invested in some kinds of issues there. Similarly, a lot of those statements that were area specific, sorry, let me take it one quick step back about that. The other aspect to the survey, which I think is worth bringing up, is that pass or unsure was a really important quality. It wasn't that everyone got random questions out of the 200. Actually, the system basically would always, for a new person, try to figure out what's the right question to ask. It's like the GRE where it modifies the questions that it shows you on the computer. What's the next question that will best determine either the location of this person relative to other people, or a question that it's not sure where to place. So it was asking everyone different questions as needed. And for example, if a question that was really South Norwalk specific or East Norwalk specific, like was one that people passed on repeatedly because they aren't living there, those questions kind of quickly fell to the bottom of the barrel. And so it tended to ask questions it needed to know more about. But that's sort of internally behind the scenes. The reason why I'm saying all that is another aspect of why, if you quickly go back to the previous slide, not to belabor this too much, but part of why we like the idea of this is this did two things, right? There were 100 different statements that you could respond to. So people who really wanted to weigh in, who had a specific issue or point they wanted to really drive home, they could vote on all the 200 statements, right? Or they could come back and vote on statements they hadn't seen yet, and so on and so forth. People who just wanted to vote on a couple statements and move on with their day, same. They could just vote on 5 or 7 and still be counted, which means that people who wanted to submit a bajillion statements and vote on them all and really weigh in, instead of it being something where we have a lot of Post-it notes and that dominates the conversation, in the end, that one person only counts as one person. And so we allowed everyone to sort of have the amount of engagement they wanted to have with it, but we also tried to account for people who gave the survey a heavier touch versus a lighter touch. And that is reflected in, counting it by number of respondents, not just number of votes. So
Diane Cece did not vote 434 times.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Right. So what we found is between A and B, right, there was a level of sort of consensus and disagreement, but it's not just if you were in group A or B. Within that, there's a wide range of what people could agree or disagree with. And, all the stuff on the further you get to the left, the more likely it was that a statement would be generally agreeable with everyone. And then a statement on the right basically would be one which most clearly defined A versus B as the system defined it. So, things like industrial zoning needs to consider effects on existing residential communities, whether you like industry or don't like industry, they agreed with that kind of a statement. All the way to general, almost full consensus for things like contractor yards and residential areas should not be interspersed, right? There's a fundamental incompatibility there. A little more on the line, we had some particularly polemic statements just to see what people thought about them. Things that, maybe are all the way as almost a classic, maybe not, right? Current industrial zoning is appropriate and needs no modifications. The point of statements like that were to get a reaction out of people and then lead to submitting other statements that maybe would be more agreeable, all the way to, at the most divisive, restricting truck operations could address conflicts between residences and businesses. Some people agreed and others didn't. Next slide. So to that end, we had the two groups, right? And so what we have here, what we pulled out are basically 5 relatively indicative statements that helped define group A, right? And so group A, you can see that's the middle one, right? So those are all mostly green bars. That is to say, 92% of group A agreed with the first statement, 1% disagreed, and 6% passed. Whereas in group B, it was like split, half, or a third, right? So all 5 of these were pretty solidly agreed for group A, right? Industrial uses can be good. A healthy mix is critical. There should be a balance. Maybe they can coexist. We should encourage it, but location matters. It can't just be arts, restaurants, and businesses, and we should actively encourage industry, right? Those are the kinds of things that we heard generally for group A. Supportive of industrial growth, supportive of a balance of uses, and sensitive to the issues between them. On the other hand, we had group B, less supportive of growth. So you can see things that defined group B. The first 3 are things that group B strongly agreed with, right? South Norwalk is trying to be a cosmopolitan neighborhood, and industry doesn't work with that. Industrial sites should not be anywhere near where you have to have commercial traffic to get to the highway. And sort of an almost rhetorical question, why should Norwalk house industrial zones that benefit the residents of other towns, right? Like Norwalk for Norwalk, right? The last 2 statements were statements that very much defined group B, but in opposition, right? So 70% of people in group B did not agree with that you should actively promote more industrial development, or that it's well located and residential neighbors need to accept disruption. So that issue, the sort of should it be here or should it not, was the general determinant of what people thought one way or the other. So if you go to the next slide, there's the different issue. And this is kind of, in many ways, the point of the survey, right? You can be pro-industry, you can be anti-industry, such as we just saw in the previous 2 slides, but one way or the other, there were certain kinds of statements that everyone agreed with, right? So remember, group B had a lot of the people that answered group B, 70, 80%, didn't think that there should be a place for encouraged or increased industrial development, but issues that unite everyone. Classic, urban planning. Even in 2021, even with us all quarantining, we can all get behind a strong displeasure of traffic issues, especially in East Norwalk, right? So that's an important thing to think about. Whether you like the industry or not, everyone agrees that traffic is actually hurting that part of the city, right? The idea of light versus heavy industry. This is something which we heard a lot also during our focus areas, right? Or during our stakeholder interviews, that industry isn't just one specific thing, right? It could go all the way from, heavy manufacturing to advanced, lighter manufacturing to new kinds of sort of technology or fabrication that don't necessarily emit noxious noises or fumes, but that distinction isn't fully drawn out at the moment. Water also unites everyone. This really clarified that from the perspective of everyone who we talked to, the waterfront, even though there's industrial areas on the waterfront, is a completely, it's a horse of a completely different color than everything else in Norwalk from industrial perspectives. And whether you like industry or not, the fact that industry is right next to residential is a serious thing that everyone needs to think about. So the good news is this basically lets us, on the one hand, none of this is rocket science now that we say it. These are all fairly reasonable things for us to think about as next steps. but it's reassuring from our perspective that everyone who filled out this thing, whether it was industrial business owners to constituents, to nearby residents, to interested parties, all could kind of get their head around some common language around the issues that we face next. So where we want to go from here is basically to think about, there are some issues that get consensus across the board. This is kind of like the common understanding of the problem. And then between groups A and B, that's where the complicated things come in. And that's where the more complicated urban design challenges, issues we need to think about solving, and sort of the design challenges actually are where we want to kind of find some kind of a middle ground between A and B. Because
another way of putting what Will's saying is that these 4, let's say, consensus statements across the spectrum of people that are already engaged in this plan because they participate in the survey are actually excellent marching orders for our priorities as we dive into the kind of technical planning, because each one of those alone and together are about resolving inherent conflicts, around traffic, around use categories, around the waterfront, and that relationship between industrial areas and residential areas. So I think Maggie's going to pivot for us to what that looks like.
So I think that, given our business interviews and one-on-one conversations, as well as the themes and consensus statements that emerge from the survey, we have sort of 4 areas that we're going to start to move forward and develop in terms of topics and questions that we're going to be asking. So they really are sort of like fundamental next steps. So the first is really thinking about Norwalk's regional position. So while Norwalk is well positioned for regional advantage, this is something that we heard a lot from the industrial business owners, this location next to 95, the fact that there are industrial zones, whereas in neighboring places there might not be. The question remains, should it be the industrial district for all of Fairfield County, and how do you manage that, or how would you move forward with managing that? A second area of interest is thinking about industrial trends and what that sort of question about heavy industry versus light industry, and what does industry really look like and mean for the future. So what are emerging industrial trends, and how do they inform the future of the development in the city? That has to do with space requirements, effects on the environment, et cetera, et cetera. And like Will was just mentioning, the waterfront really does emerge as a sort of unique entity because it has such a symbolic and cultural importance, but also sort of use in terms of water-based industry. So how do you balance marine industrial uses, marine commercial uses, recreational boating, residential uses, and public access along the waterfront? So really focusing in on the waterfront as its own entity. And the last, sort of being a broad category, but I think very important one, is industrial uses and their relationship to other uses. So how can planning and policy really help to mitigate conflicts between industrial uses and embedding residential and commercial areas? So with those 4 questions and 4 topics in mind, that sort of leads us to our next steps. So in each of these next slides, we're just sort of going to take each of those topics and sort of break down what it is we're going to do as a consultant team to move forward and develop.
Is it worth, Maggie and Will, before we go into those, to get some feedback on those list of 4 takeaways from the group? It might be useful.
Yeah.
Does that, and the committee and you, Steve, too, like, do you think that those questions that become in a way our the kind of framing of our next steps broadly capture the things that you thought when you hired us you wanted us to?
On the issue of Norwalk being the industrial district for all of Fairfield County, I'm not sure that we're positioned for that, in the sense that I'm not sure we have the infrastructure. We don't have the buildings. I'm not sure we have the space to be able to carry that out, even if we wanted to. And it certainly appears as if from the surveys that the respondents are really not looking for Norwalk to do that. But in any case, I'm just not sure that our existing industrial spaces have the capacity to do that, even if we wanted to.
I think that question, I think is an economic development strategy moving forward, absolutely. But I think that's the reason some of the existing industrial businesses are in Norwalk, contractor yards and, so I think there is a market rationale why certain legacy buildings are in the city. And I think that we want to drill into that a little bit. So this is as much kind of explaining the current situation and what the history of those uses might be as a kind of proactive plan for the city, if that makes sense.
I understand what you're saying. I'm wondering if it might be articulated different.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's especially for a kind of public reception, it's probably a good point.
The way I would put it is, that kind of a question has a lot loaded in it, right? Why should we be the industrial zone of Fairfield County and no one else has to deal with it, right? Like that actually, it's not really so much a question as a statement that I don't think we should be doing that. So the way we should be taking that away as planners, I think, is that whether it's true or not, that that's what Norwalk is, that's definitely a perception. And so what it really speaks to is the value that people are seeing out of the industrial districts versus what it's costing the city. And so it just reminds us that as we're thinking about the study and as we're thinking about the role of these zones and the definitions of them, we have to be really clear about what it is providing for the city and what it's costing. And having that be, one big piece of how not just we're thinking about the analysis, but as we're putting it together, that sort of balance or value proposition is a fundamental piece of the decision making.
I think how we're imagining tackling each of those in the next slides that Maggie's going to show will, I think, Lou, partly answer your question about our perception on that question, but I agree that we'll work on the wording for that first one.
Just to interject, I think most people in Norwalk would actually think that Bridgeport is the industrial center of Fairfield County and not Norwalk.
Yeah, again, I think that we, for some subset of the industrial and heavy commercial businesses that are in Norwalk, and I would include heavy commercial there too, auto repair and Norwalk is much more convenient to the rest of Fairfield County because it's in the center of it than Bridgeport. And that's why, when I grew up in Wilton, we would take our cars to get fixed in Norwalk, and why, the contractors that serve that market are in Norwalk. And so I think our perspective on that, again, is maybe the logic of some subset of current commercial activity in Norwalk, and again, not necessarily relative to things like manufacturing and fabrication and the things that we normally think about with industrial. Bridgeport is certainly a better fit for those kinds of things. But I think between Tammy, your comment, and Lou's comment, I think that we've got to work on the messaging of that a little bit, and maybe we have to think a little bit about what our next steps are going to be on that issue too.
This is Sabrina. Just to chime in, I think it's important to include it kind of with that question, what the market is showing. And I think that will kind of form the answer to that question really well is, what are the demand for the space requirements for these types of businesses? And are they readily available, ready to move in? Kind of what does that look like? Because from my perspective, I've actually seen, over the past month, a huge increase for need for larger industrial space, which wasn't happening before. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what the market is saying for need for those spaces before we, designate ourselves that or work towards that. It's kind of like, okay, we can position ourselves to be that. And do we want that or do we don't want that is yet to be kind of dissected, but at the same time, is the market, it's one thing to want something, and the market will definitely tell you what will actually happen and what won't.
Yeah, and I think on the flip side, there's some uses in Norwalk now that maybe, the city, public opinion, your consultants maybe wish they weren't there, but they've got no other place to go. I mean, it's a problem we face in industrial districts and a lot of this work that we do, which is, I wish the salt pile or the tank farm or name it went someplace else. And it was a big question when we did the New Haven industrial study, and it's like, well, they're not going anywhere else because nobody else wants them, So I think maybe this is a good segue, Maggie, to how we think we're going to address that in these other takeaways, and maybe we can continue the conversation with those slides.
Okay, sure. So yeah, I think getting back to your questions and comments about Norwalk's relationship to the rest of Fairfield County, I think what we want to do is sort of refine our market analysis of regional. These arrow bullet points sort of are what we were thinking are our concrete sort of next steps and tasks for ourselves. So refining our sort of market analysis of regional industries, that's kind of getting to your point, Sabrina, and looking at researching other regional municipal plans to see if there are other places that are also maybe trying to attract industry and how Norwalk would fit in with that sort of ecosystem of industrial development. And then also looking at sort of transportation and logistics challenges, especially looking at traffic and street priorities and truck access. On the right is an example from our analysis of the Newmarket industrial area in Boston, and just we foresee doing some sort of truck access analysis and looking at the relationship to 95 and the relationship to other areas in Fairfield County to have a better understanding of the spatial implications of the sort of regional industry. So that's one. And looking at, also touching on your point, Sabrina, about industrial trends and what sorts of industry or manufacturing might be emerging, or that other issue of defining what light industry actually looks like. I think we're curious to sort of illustrate and define different types of space requirements and what the space constraints might actually be for different types of industry. On the right, you'll see a diagram that we did for Detroit's Eastern Market, which was a block prototype that was looking at food businesses and live work. But I think that this is something that we could also look at in Norwalk as well, as sort of assessing the spatial implications of new industries and areas for growth and development and job creation that are appropriate to Norwalk and the future of industry. Specifically looking at some of the sort of
because different industrial sectors, have specific space requirements when looking for building pad sizes or sizes of sites, and that's something I think between the transportation logistics on the previous slide and the kind of market requirements on the building side, you begin to understand which existing industrial districts are viable and which ones aren't. I think we'll narrow down both the strategy and the options pretty quickly.
Yeah. And this is looking at the waterfront as kind of a little standalone issue. And I think what we want to do is do a deeper dive into relevant Norwalk waterfront plans to think about the market perspective of the shellfish industry, which I know is really unique to Norwalk, as well as its relationship to sort of commercial marinas, as well as recreational uses and public access. I think there's such a diversity of land uses that happen around the waterfront that we want to be able to map what those are and understand and evaluate sort of suitability of those waterfront parcels for different types of uses and what that mix really looks like or wants to look like. So on the right, you see sort of that type of parcel analysis around New Haven's Mill River district. And lastly, looking at industrial uses and their relationship to other uses. And this is really getting at some of the meat of the issue of abutting neighborhoods and the sort of mix of industrial uses and residential uses. So I think what we're going to do is evaluate and determine where industrial uses should not be allowed, like absolutely should not be allowed, and where they would actually, where if they were located in certain places where they would have the least amount of impact. And in doing so, we want to generate sort of development test fits that sort of understand, like Tim was just saying, understand sort of the types of buildings, the size and dimension of buildings and types of industrial uses that will be appropriate to the parcel sizes within each of the sort of focus areas. And then look at, you know, sort of mapping alternatives for boundaries or districts. And maybe that means adjusting some of the boundaries, eliminating some districts, adding to some areas, kind of reassessing what the map of industrial zones really looks like, and then recommending sort of adjustments for related ordinances that also control industrial uses. And I think the last two are sort of related, thinking about, in some cases, a lot of the parcel sizes will be very small. So maybe there will be a desire or a need to assemble for land assembly strategies in specific areas. So I think we would test that and look at where is most appropriate for land assembly or aggregation. And then also, you know, there's a lot of social services and other uses that find themselves in industrial zones as well. So we want to take a look at those uses and try to understand where they should be located as of right, or whether that sort of mixed use is appropriate for industrial uses, or for industrial zones, sorry.
Yeah, and this is really, I mean, that list falls from the 3 previous slides. If you go back a slide, Maggie, and you know, go forward a slide. Sorry.
Oh, which one? This one?
This one, right? This is kind of the heart of the plan, right? And I think looking at the market, looking at logistics, looking at the waterfront will then inform us to be able to make a series of do some scenarios and simultaneously make some recommendations where focusing on industrial makes more sense, where because of parcel sizes or transportation issues, it doesn't make sense anymore, and really be able to zero in and give you a kind of clear draft set of recommendations. And we'll use those kind of those style of graphics we've been showing you to kind of make our case.
Yeah, so that this is just a version of that. On the left, you'll see sort of a parcel test fit analysis, development test fit analysis for the Marine Industrial Park, Boston. And then on the right, sort of very typical type of test fit that looks at a mix of office and industrial uses while looking at, you know, truck turning radii and parking scenarios and relationship to the street, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the types of spatial test fits and development scenarios that we are going to look towards as we develop our analysis and our recommendations. So that's all that we have right now, but we'd welcome to continue this discussion that we're having on some of those 4 major areas, and if these next steps make sense.
Maybe if you go to the previous slide, we can leave it there because it's got the checklist there.
No one's got any questions? So not really a question per se related to that, but so just to refine and further state what your next steps are, you're looking at these bullet point items right here and then starting to refine starting to actually come up with recommendations and look at each one of these a little more in depth, plus the other items we discussed earlier on.
That's right, Steve. I think the plan is to now do actual spatial analysis and some development scenarios to tease out some preliminary recommendations as a result of that work. So I think we'll both come with maps that show where truck access makes more sense versus less, which might be Captain Obvious to many of you on the call, but important for us to actually draw through. I think it's going to be an assessment of where there are kind of soft sites and parcels where new industrial or mixed industrial commercial development is actually feasible based on floor plate sizes, you know, which is tied to the logistics and transportation question. and then make a kind of proto recommendation to this group based on that analysis. This is our hunch about maybe where the city should go. These are the reasons why. What do you think? A kind of informed draft set of hunches that grow out of that spatial analysis. I mean, that's answering your question in a different way, Steve, but does that make sense?
Yeah, and then my follow-up question would be, and I might have been having audio problems when you discussed this. When do we go out to like the broader public with some of the things that we're talking about in the recommendations and getting feedback in the different, like South Norwalk and East Norwalk and any other affected neighborhood?
I think it would be after our next meeting with this group to test those hunches, but maybe pivoting off of that meeting pretty quickly. I also think that I think telling the story about the survey and how this work that we're doing comes out of a kind of consensus understanding about where the sweet spot is to be focusing on our planning work as a preview to that would be useful too. I don't know, Will and Maggie, if that's consistent with what you were thinking.
Yeah, I think that for me, that makes a lot of sense. The next step, I think the next steering committee meeting that we have will be a pretty robust working session with you to really dive deep into some of our recommendations and to show you what we've been developing. And then based on that, I think we could maybe based on your feedback on that, we would want to take that also to the public and get more specific feedback. Right now, I think that the engagement work that we've done has been really helpful in confirming some of our initial hunches about what's going on and what the issues are on the ground. But I think, public feedback is not going to be helpful until we have something to sort of show for that. So that's what I think our next big step will be. Will, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree.
Tim, on that first bullet, evaluate and determine where industrial uses should not be allowed and where they would have the least impact. I think if you asked any of us, we could point to a couple of sites that are industrial zoned that we think just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
But that's the way they're zoned. Do you have any experience in providing alternatives? I mean, sure, we can upzone something, but the firm that is currently there has the right to remain and continue to do what it's been doing. Do you have experience with incentives or other actions that can be taken with a location where we don't think an industrial zone is appropriate in order to encourage some other use?
I think certainly upzoning with clarity is an effective tool. I mean, legacy businesses where the ownership structure wants to stay in business and doesn't want a near-term exit strategy, that's always the issue. It's a family business, but clear upzoning and allow of bonuses for specific kind of uses. And I think tinkering with ordinances related to zoning can also be useful too. Noise ordinances, enforcement, all of those things that are usually part of the suite of things that are done to get existing businesses maybe to behave better than they have been to date. But it's a good question. I mean, all a municipality can do really is set up land use policy and related ordinances to get the market to behave differently than it is now. I mean, there's other more proactive, redevelopment strategies that are possible, but I think spatializing some of this first will be important to get it all on a map, so we're all seeing the same thing you are, Lou, will be important before we start thinking about some of those other strategies, land assembly strategies, or sometimes the market beyond that ownership can be incentivized to, help do some of this work too. It's a really good question. I mean, it's the frustration of zoning revisions that all a city can do is revise the zoning, but they can't make the market specifically follow the bird seeds in the forest, right?
So can I ask this? It sounds like, Lou, I'm going to follow up on your question, I think. So is that grandfathering too? Is that something that it sounds like you're speaking to? Because some of these places in South Norwalk, once a business leaves, another similar business comes in and does the same thing. And Steve, or anybody on the zoning commission, or even John, changing the grandfathering aspect is part of, is that something the council would have to do?
I
Or
don't
is
think you
that
can,
even possible?
I don't think you can. If there's an existing use on a property that's non-conforming, I don't think you could, you can't really kick them out of that location until they leave the site and a different use goes in, then you can, prevent them.
So I think, so I think that's what I heard. Lou said something about, what did you call it? What?
Upzoning?
Upzoning.
Which is, if I think two, if I can just step in for a second, I think there's two conceptual points here. One is if you allow a higher density of non-industrial uses, that's legal and not considered a taking because you're increasing the conceptual land, the parcel value. I think the other thing the city can do is the city can restrict what's possible under a kind of grandfathering clause, which is an issue that we're dealing with on a current rezoning efforts that we're involved with now, which is, can you put an addition on your existing facility or make changes that are up to 10% of the total existing floor area? Is it more permissive at 25% now? Can you reduce that to 10%? There's ways around the edges. You can tinker around the edges with revisions to the land use policy that might make grandfathering just a little bit more difficult.
But it is worth saying that, this idea of grandfathering and, adding density to zoning to deal with the kinds of uses, like the reason why it's such an easy go-to tool is because it actually, in a strange way, it forces a reckoning of like everyone's position to come to the best possible arrangement, sort of, right? Like if there's a current owner that likes things the way they are enough, then like in the most basic, I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but like if they're happy-ish, then the only way that we can make them happy and get to a solution that makes everyone else reasonably happy is to incentivize, like it actually is. Unless they can be happy enough to want to change, then we have to find a way to do right by both the existing property owner and people who want to see a difference. So in a strange way, thinking about what the thing is that we want to incentivize via density or increased uses or whatever else, that in and of itself is a massive part of the negotiation. Because if we can come to something which is different, more possibly has some other kinds of restrictions and get the property owner on board, that's actually a pretty substantial outcome. So I wouldn't jump to think that the idea of upzoning or changing the use is like a loss. In many ways, that's actually the tools we have to come up with something that works for everyone.
I had a question that I wanted to ask. Am I on?
Yes, but your dog's not.
I think one of the things that all of us on the commission have seen over the last several years, and as a land use attorney I've seen for the last 40 years, is that we have a lot of text change amendments in our code. And I'm wondering if the industrial areas that you have investigated and studied in other areas have as much provision for residential use within those zones. Because, take Martin Luther King Highway for an example, that was designated to be a restricted industrial zone, and it was a little more difficult to find tenants and users for that use than they had hoped it would be. And therefore, virtually every other lot on Martin Luther King is a condominium project. And when you have residences right next door to industrial properties, it creates a difficulty. And I'm just wondering, in some of the other areas that you've studied, do they have similar problems to that?
Yeah, I think the flip side of all of this is in most industrial areas of the city, there's actually a wide range of uses that are already allowed. And I think that's a little bit the barn door has been open problem, which
Yes.
is if multifamily residential is allowed as of right, and that's the highest and best use, it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle, especially because some savvy industrial parcel owners will perceive that as a taking. And so I think one of the other challenges that we're all going to have to face is, we'll make a map and show the truck circulation, and we'll discover that, I don't know, 60% of the current industrial areas of Norwalk still make sense. I'm just making that up, but they have less of an impact on residential areas. The truck access is pretty good. It's never going to be perfect in Norwalk. Allowing for some commercial and industrial development moving forward is good for the tax base, but lo and behold, those areas already allow, through special permit residential XYZ. And so we're going to have a discussion about pulling back some of those allowable uses to steer those uses to other places. I think it's easier to pull that back away when it's a special permit process than if those uses are allowed as of right. But we'll have to have a discussion about that because in a way, your industrial districts anyway are almost laissez-faire based on our initial analysis that we did, in November. And Richard, you would know better than anyone about that in a lot of the districts, there are other uses that are already allowed, right?
Yes.
But what Tim's getting at, that balance is basically, okay, so if we wanted to tighten down on some level the allowable uses to have industrial zones be more industrial, then you need to do something else to kind of not have it be a taking, right? And so there's sort of two levers that we have available in some form. One is then I'll amp up what you can do industrially there so that we're not just removing what you can do, we're just modifying it to better conform to what the zone is going to be, and potentially add capacity, right? So it's not just more intensive uses, it might be more of it. And basically it's like the areas that should be industrial, let's make them industrial. And the areas that kind of aren't anymore, let's just call them what they are, and actually then have it kind of reflect a combination of what's good for the city and what the reality on the ground is.
Yeah, and I think that's
when I say it like that, it sounds very easy.
But that's good messaging in
devils in the
general as
details.
an outcome of this plan. The only rub is that back to the understanding of this group and Lou's statement earlier that I think we would all agree which places make sense and which ones don't, except for the individual parcel owner who might be a speculator who is the landlord of industrial building there are probably a few people in Norwalk that are sitting on industrial property and have current industrial uses there. But when the market is right or they're ready to make the move, they'd look at the zoning code and say, at some point I can do residential here through a special permit, let's say. And so there's always two audiences for this kind of plan. One is general public perception, look how balanced and how, and the other is that particular parcel owner who, as soon as he perceives that changes in the code are a taking, are going to cry foul and get involved and, XYZ. So I think that also is probably should be on the agenda for our next meeting, which is that once we map these things out, what does it finally mean on the ground? Both in terms of what makes sense and doesn't, and where it still makes sense for the areas to be industrial, what is the current zoning and what are our legal avenues to make some adjustments? Does that answer your question, Richard? Or fulfill your...
I didn't really have so much of I did have a question as to whether you experienced that in other areas or not. I certainly, didn't mean that one of those uses should be discouraged to go away. I'm just saying that it almost creates a war zone. That's all, just a general comment.
Yeah, okay.
But one thing that I think we can all agree on is that current zoning that allows for residential and low density industrial in an area where all the mixes combine is not the best solution. So what we want to do is find a way to actually encourage a change that is relatively equally a little bit disagreeable to everyone involved. And then we can feel like we did a good job, right? It's going to be different. So in that sense, the change can be complicated, but our job is to basically
Are you kidding?
try
Me
to
and my
find that
daughter
balance.
were the basketball.
Is anybody else hearing that besides me?
Yeah, I took
Yeah.
care of it.
Oh,
Yeah, this is John. I got a quick question. So, I mean, to Dick's point, where if current industrial zoning through special permit could be developed into residential. And Dick, is that a good summary of your point?
yes, yes.
Okay,
exactly.
so, I mean, it seems to me that the direction that we would go, seeing that, I mean, it's all about supply and demand. If you have a developer that wants to come into industrial zone and apply for that special permit and to build some residential, that's what's going to happen now. So I think I'm just trying to find the point of this. Where are we trying to retain the industrial zoning we have now? Because, or are we just trying to take the industrial to switch these industrial zones to a zoning that would be more accommodating and not have to have special permitting to allow for residential?
I would say, I mean, I don't know the answer yet because we haven't done the planning, but I would suspect the answer is going to be a combo platter where, we might say to the city, just as a hypothetical and to this committee first, we recommend of these 5-6 industrial areas that you maintain these two, because you're going to want a place to steer industrial and commercial development. And I would say that I would say it's probably going to want to be a hybrid commercial industrial districts where you might want to shut a little bit the barn door for residential in those areas. And then we might say in these 3 or 4 industrial districts, it doesn't make sense to even call them industrial districts anymore. They might be mixed use districts. And you might ease the path to residential or other commercial uses. We'll determine that with you collaboratively. That's where I think this is going. But
Right. Well, you had mentioned waterfront. Obviously, there's a value there. They're not building any more of it. So I mean, that always spiked my interest where we're going to, change the zoning for some of our waterfront. But I also, someone I served with on the council many years ago said to me, I mean, once you get rid of the industrial areas, they're not coming back. And that always stuck with me because, they do serve a purpose. And how you had mentioned before, we have a lot of blue collar contractors, that are, reside in Norwalk and do a lot of their business in Norwalk. And yeah, we are amongst our affluent community, the place to go for these industrial uses. So I do place some importance on that as well. I guess I'm just trying to wrap my head around this and just try to figure out, for me, where I'd like to see this go, and knowing, the layout of Norwalk and what's out there and what's currently zoned industrial.
I think this is just an appetizer for what we're going to talk about in detail at our next meeting. I think we need some maps. We might come with a couple of alternatives. Like one way to go is to keep these as industrial, do this. Another option might be to call these all mixed use districts and just know that the risk is that over a couple of development cycles, there might not be any land left for industrial leaning commercial uses. Maybe you're okay with that. So I think we can provide a couple of scenarios and then have you each weigh in what you see as the pros and cons from an economic development standpoint, from a tax-based standpoint, from a Norwalk lifestyle standpoint. and give you the tools at our next meeting to kind of have a robust debate about that, maybe
I mean,
among
it's
yourselves.
going to be a double-edged sword. I mean, at least with my experience as well, say for instance, an example is you have an industrial use development currently that's being underutilized, like let's just say not fully occupied. You've got a 9 to 5 business there, and then you propose a 300 apartment mixed use development, and it's like you've got some who just are looking at it from a traffic perspective, and you have some that feel that it's going to provide something for the community. I mean, so I guess I'm looking at it from a political viewpoint where you're going to get people on either side of this argument, no matter what you do. But I'm done.
I think that, but that's the crux of it, right, John? I mean, I think the good news is that you have a lot of places where you can put industrial. So I think back to some of Will and Maggie's comments, I think there are enough districts, land use districts in the city where maybe we can all have our cake and eat it too. That's a little bit. It's not even a hunch. It's a proto hunch with UTIL, which is that we think when people understand the logistical issues and the kind of value proposition of waterfront or not, that there might be something for everybody.
And we do have a little time for public comment. I see we have one hand raised. I don't know if anybody else has any questions before I let anybody else chime in for a couple of minutes before we adjourn. All right, Diane, you are on if you want to go.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for those that are volunteering to sit in on this, and as well as UTIL. This is Diane Lauricella. I had a very good discussion with the UTIL representatives. I just wanted, for the sake of the council people and the zoning commissioners on this call, one thing that I think might be needed, especially before a major public meeting or additional public surveying, has to do with realizing that there's a stigma to industrial use in this city and in many cities, but I live here and I've lived here for 35 years. We had an area of Muller Park that was upzoned back in the 80s just because there was one tenant that, and this is located off of Perry Avenue up close to Merritt Parkway. And let's see, I guess you can't see me. I don't know if, well, that's my, anyway, can you guys see me or?
No, we can see your dog.
I don't know how to change that here, but anyway, because of that, the Conservation Commission and Zoning, instead of employing enforcement to force that tenant and the landlord to mind the odors that were emanating, it was a coffee processing company. And I love coffee, especially in the morning, but of course, when it's an industrial use, it was horrible for the near neighborhood. So instead of using enforcement tools for an active and a good tax base and jobs that people could walk to, they instead upzone the entire parcel, thereby limiting what that owner, which is still the same owner, can do. And many of the uses are not highest and best use related to industrial jobs. The second thing is, I think the public needs and our officials need to understand with maybe a menu of good and clean industry, both light and heavy, that is the current trend because of the fact that there is the stigma that it's a belching, an industrial use is belching smokestacks and pollutes the ground and the air and the water. That is not allowed anymore, except when there is no enforcement. And as we've seen in South Norwalk and other places, the enforcement has to step up in this city so that everyone can try to live in harmony. and also encourage and incentivize clean industry to come into the city, such as the use of creation of and manufacture of microgreens like they are doing in Bridgeport. They take an old building, it's a farm indoors, and it's a great job. It's a job that people can walk to in the neighborhood. And lastly, I just wanted to say that MLK Drive, I was there when it was just being constructed. And unfortunately, due to politics and at the time, land use commissioner selection, there was kind of a leakage of other uses. And quite frankly, prior to this current Chamber of Commerce, they never really looked for clean industrial use. And I remember going up to a zoning meeting where someone proposed to put residential and industrial, such as what we have behind Norden with now Avalon, it was then Spinnaker. And it was such a shame that we have squandered so many of our industrial sites because of the trends. So that when Sabrina, when you said we got to test the market, I just want to say, I'm glad to see that you're getting inquiries, but what is our redevelopment agency and Jessica and the staff doing to seek out clean industry? It's because we can't just wait for them to come to us. What are we doing to actually attract them? And lastly, there needs to be very, very good review of the jobs creation and in expanding the barriers or the buffers between abutting residential use, because that too was supposed to happen in your law, in the regulation, and it wasn't enforced. And many neighborhoods, including many I worked with in South Norwalk, were badly affected by that with noise, odor, and dust. So good luck. And I really enjoyed speaking with the UTL people. And I just wish that we would educate people about clean industry before we do any more sorting or surveying, because I believe a lot of the people that said they were anti-industrial use do not understand that you can have clean industry. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else like to chime in quickly? Can use the raise your hand function and I will let you talk. If not, going once, going twice, any other comments from any of the committee members? Hearing none, we can adjourn for the evening. And so just before we close, when do you think time frame roughly for next get together?
Will, Tim.
Maggie will take a stab at it. 3 weeks from now? 3 weeks
Yeah.
would work, probably.
3 weeks seems reasonable.
Okay, so maybe when we get about 2 weeks out, see where you're at, and then we can,
Right.
If you need a little more time, that's fine. Otherwise, we can start looking at dates for a meeting.
Okay, that sounds good.
I think the only comment about that is we want to bring, all those streams together at the next meeting and not just have the individual pieces there, because I think the intersection of some of those issues we want to look at are going to be the things that bring clarity around this discussion. So we want to do some fairly comprehensive work between now and then.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I appreciate everybody's time today. And what we can do is we're going to post this. Well, obviously the meeting will get posted on the city's YouTube channel. We'll probably run a blog on Norwalk tomorrow. So if Will, Maggie have any comments or bullet points or takeaways about the survey results that you want included, please get them to me and I can have those incorporated too.
Okay, that sounds good.
Great. Okay, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Talk to you next time.
Thank you for your feedback. Take
Okay.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.